Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioural change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioural experts across industries and organisations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviourist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast. In this episode, I sit down with Guy Champniss from Meltwater Consulting. This is a very exciting episode for me, as Guy and I share a very similar background in terms of our academic and PhD training and our shared trajectory into behavioral science consulting. Guy is one of those rare breeds of a modern thinker, the perfect blend between scientist and practitioner. He's doing the important work at the intersection of the two worlds, translating insights between research and business. His take on the social element of customer identity and business generally is refreshing and something that I believe is the next big thing for applied BS. And in particular, the big social challenges we talk about in the last little bit of the episode are worth sticking around for. A little housekeeping. If you like the sound of all these BS ideas, be sure to subscribe on Apple iTunes. That way you can get a new episode and interview every single Monday morning. A little inspiration for the start of the week. And if you like what you hear, can I ask a favor and leave a rate and review on iTunes? And please, as always, email me with feedback and questions about the show. Thanks for tuning in, and without further ado, here's my wonderful conversation with Guy Champniss. Guy is a consultant and academic, founder of Meltwater Consulting, and behavioral science lead to award-winning U.S. energy and behavior tech company Enervee. He's also a visiting professor of consumer behavior at IE University's School of Human Sciences and Technology in Madrid. Guy is focused on the application of social psychology and behavioral science in consumer contexts, with a specific focus on creating prosocial consumer behavior. Guy works across a number of sectors, including banking, healthcare, education, market research, FMCG, and technology. He's co-authored the book Brand Valued: How Socially Valued Brands Hold the Key to a Sustainable Future and Business Success. And his award-winning research on prosocial consumer behavior has been published in Technological Forecasting and Social Change, Energy Efficiency, and Harvard Business Review. Guy's research in applied behavioral science and social psychology has been presented at leading conferences and has been widely published in academic outlets and, as I said, in HBR as well. He also speaks frequently at conferences on behavioral science and sustainability. He holds an MBA and a prize-winning PhD in applied experimental social psychology. He lives in Bath, England, with his wife and 3 children. Guy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for finding the time.
Of course. And we have a very similar background, and it seems actually a very similar trajectory that we followed from out of academia and into more the applied work we're doing now. But we are both of us social psychologists by training. And not, even within that domain of social psychology, we also did a lot of research specifically on social identity theory. And I see that has informed a lot of the work that you're doing now in practice, which is sort of new. And you don't see a lot of it being mentioned in applied behavioral insights or behavioral science. Even with, you don't hear the mention of social psychology. Do you find that's the case? Have you met other people? Are there other people like us out there doing the kind of work?
I think you're probably right. Actually, quite often when I talk about, with my PhD was in social, an application of social identity theory, and I find myself, when you say those words, you look at people's faces, and quite often they can look a little bit sort of concerned because it sounds a little bit too sociological. Mm-hmm. And probably their immediate thought is this is going to be quite woolly and sort of subjective. Obviously, we know that's definitely not the case. So I think you're right. I don't hear it spoken about that much. I mean, when I finished my PhD, some of the work we did, which was specifically around brands creating temporary social identities in order to encourage their users, their consumers, to engage in certain behaviors above and beyond, what a brand would normally expect you to do. So buy it, rebuy it, talk about it, whatever. Certainly that work was, we think quite novel, which got us into HBR with quite a big piece, and we got good feedback from that. But I suppose I guess my sense is that maybe there's lots of other bits of social psychology that gets redressed as behavioral science in the sort of commercial world, which are probably just a little harder edged. So they just naturally transfer more easily, and people find the case studies not just extremely vivid, but potentially very easy to copy in some way. So I think it might be that it's just the social identity stuff is maybe just a little bit more nuanced than certainly I think what a lot of the sort of the sort of industry application of behavioral science potentially right now has an appetite for, or certainly there's easier stuff to consume. Maybe that's another way of saying it.
Yeah, I think it's sort of the branding and just how it just so happened to take off over the last decade, and it seems that to go from behavioral economics to behavioral science was an easier transition than to go from behavioral economics to social psychology. Even though what I find ironic and interesting is that so much of applied behavioral science, especially now more than ever, with nudging and any of the other buzzwords we use, is that so much emphasis is put on context, and in particular context that involve social variables and social norms and social environments. And so it just seems, and again, we're biased, and I'm biased in having this position, but it seems that a lot of the industry related behavioral science work lends itself so beautifully, so nicely to social psychology. And I kind of want to take a few steps back, because here we are using lingo, and we're probably guilty of the curse of knowledge. Can you explain for listeners who might not know what the hell even social identity is?
I'll give it a good go. So social identity theory puts forward the idea that as well as having a personal identity that is a key bit of what's often called the sort of the self concept, in other words, who we think we are, there's also this whole sort of palette or array of social identities that we draw on multiple times a day, different identities at different moments in different contexts. And so actually our self concept is made up of two things: a sort of stable personal identity, and it's not volatile, it's just a very variable social identity piece. So for example, you mentioned in the intro that that I live in Bath in the UK. Obviously you're Canadian, I'm British, so there's a social identity that's potentially primed in me at the moment, is being a Brit and living in Bath. I'm going to Madrid tomorrow to teach on Friday, and an identity that'll be primed at that point is being a visiting professor at the school. So these identities, I often describe them as being a little bit like radio stations, in the sense that they're all out there all the time, but we just dial into different ones at different moments. And really what sort of motivates us to dial into these is because a particular identity in a particular moment can take away ambiguity in the sort of social situation. So we tend to latch on to an identity when there's a sense that it gives us greater confidence to understand not just how to behave, but how to sort of garner praise for that behavior, etc. So I think that's probably the best I can do off of sort of in terms of describing what it is. I think it's particularly interesting in the consumer context, because if you think that all these different social contexts can trigger or prime different social identities, it's something which most actually not most, I think all market research by and large fails to pick up on, in the sense that if you ask someone something in one situation, ask them in another situation, and also if you try and predict their behavior in one situation or another, unless you take into consideration this idea that actually the context itself has not just a sort of social influence, but almost like a sort of social psychological influence, then it'll just look like a very noisy bit of research or a very noisy bit of market research, when the reality is we're missing one of these key variables, which is, when do we speak to the consumer? Under what circumstances, in what context are we trying to predict them, and or predict ourselves? And if we don't take that bit into consideration, I think we do just tend to leave ourselves wide open, to getting it, spectacularly wrong. Which,
Mm-hmm.
considering you and I are very focused now on trying to use this work in a commercial context, if you get it wrong, then that's potentially very expensive, for a business, both in sort of actual costs, but also potentially in terms of reputation.
Right.
If you have a chronic misfire because you completely misjudged consumer appetite or consumer interest in something, it goes wrong all the way around the houses, so to speak. And I think that's one of the areas where certainly this bit of applied, social psychology could be very useful for companies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so social identities predict some of the biggest, most high impact, meaningful behaviors in all domains of human existence. You just think of religion and culture and family life and sports and I mean military, you name it, anywhere. Often these social identities are primed, and when they are primed, they can lead to these monumental outcomes, both good and bad. And so, to me and to you, obviously, in your work, it's not surprising to think that they should also be considered and modeled in our analyses, with things like brands and buying decisions, and even on the employee side as well, priming a social identity for a company or for an organization that you work for. And yet, like you've said and alluded to, it just seems to be completely absent from the conversation of applied behavioral science.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, certainly if you look at, certainly here in the UK, one of the sort of most high-profile outlets, I guess, for behavioral science in practice is the Behavioural Insights team. That was spun out of the UK government,
Mm-hmm.
and I haven't seen that conversation in the work that they do. I'm not sort of singling them out to criticise them. I'm just saying that they're probably the most high-profile and most prolific sort of voice in the UK. I do wonder whether it's because, though, it's I think, broadly speaking, one of the reasons that behavioural science is so attractive to business at the moment as a discipline, not as a function. I think that's a completely different sort of conversation, but as a discipline, is because invariably it seems to be very cheap, very fast, and very effective. Those are three characteristics that I think every business likes the sound of. And I just wonder, and I think that's probably, behavioral science is slightly a victim of its own success in that respect, because obviously, it's not those things all the time. And like any social science, there's a lot of nuance and context, in there as well. But there are enough case studies and enough examples where I think a lot of businesses, a lot of people think, yeah, this stuff is really straightforward. Let's just apply a social norm here. Let's have a descriptive norm over there and an injunctive norm here, and
Mm-hmm.
let's prime a self-efficacy effect over there, and whatever it may be. And I think probably the sort of social identity stuff, it doesn't package itself quite so cleanly a lot of the time. So I don't think it's any more complex or nuanced than a lot of the other pieces of work, but I just don't think it lends itself to that packaging exercise maybe quite as cleanly as some of the other bits. So it may well be that it just hasn't yet had its moment, because I think maybe as the industry around the application of all of this develops and maybe matures a bit, maybe the appetite for more nuance will increase,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe there'll be
And
other.
that's the
Yeah.
conversation that I've had with folks like yourself and others, where I think this is sort of the big next nut to crack. I think we've figured out quite a bit of stuff when it comes to these various interventions and primes that you listed there. But as I said, a lot of the big meaningful changes from a behavior change perspective is at the unit of analysis at the level of the group or the team, or when it comes to ideology and these sorts of things. But as you also said a few minutes ago, these social identities relative to the more stable personal identities are more variable and inherently a little bit more noisy. So I think perhaps some of the reluctance to dive into that space has been because it is a little bit more difficult to intervene on and to track and to measure. But that shouldn't be the reason why we don't actually deal in it. It should be all the more reason why we choose to focus on those things.
Yeah, and I think probably I agree with you, and I think there's certainly when I watch people's faces, I mean, sort of teaching this area generally is very easy to do because everyone is by and large, everyone is fascinated by the topic. They are sort of intrigued by both how complex and simple, large chunks of behavior are.
And if I may, sorry to interrupt, why it's so beautifully simple yet elegant is, I think, in the seminal study, which here I am quizzing you again of like, you have to put your instructor hat on, your lecturer hat here. The seminal study by Tajfel and Turner, Henry Tajfel, which I think just sums up. It's still one of my favorite social psychological findings and effects of the minimal group identity. Would you mind walking us through that study, and then we can get back to your point?
Yeah, no, sure. I think you're absolutely right. The sort of minimal group paradigm study is a really sort of bizarre and intriguing sort of foundational piece of sort of social identity theory. And essentially, that came about because, as you said, Henri Tajfel and John Turner and others, saw these sort of group effects very clearly. That basically you get the sort of the in-group, out-group effect. Where actually if you're in a group, you're prepared to sacrifice some benefit to the group if it basically puts a bigger gap between what you get and what the out-group gets. In other words, it's completely nonsensical in the sense that you're destroying value for yourself and others in the group, but you're just widening the contrast between your group and another one, and that seems to be an overriding motivation. And then the minimal group work is where they said, well, let's try and work out what does the group need to have in terms of its definition to see these behaviors happen. With having looked previously at whether it's people who support one football team versus another, all these group structures where you could say, well, there's a lot of sort of infrastructure around the group. And what they found is actually, literally, if you go into a room and you sort of have a group of people and you go do the classic sort of head count as you do as a sports teacher at school, and you go 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2, and all the twos stand on one side and all the ones stand on the other. So it's a completely arbitrary, division of the room. These group effects still occur, and this is, this was the basis of the sort of minimal group paradigm, that actually simply being put quite arbitrarily into a group causes people to engage in behaviors that are supportive of the group, and quite often the easiest way to support the group is to be critical or to derogate the other group, so which is fascinating and and depressing at the same time, that we are sort of profoundly. I mean, it gets overused. We are profoundly social creatures. I think everyone would agree with that. But the minimal group paradigm, lays it out there in sort of really bright sunlight to show that actually, just with the whiff of a group, and we're in there. I mean, there are caveats to it. There's this concept of normative fit, where if the group engages in something which just from a normative point of view feels wrong, then we won't do it, etc. But with those exceptions to one side, the minimal group paradigm just reveals that, under the most flimsy and temporary of sort of constructs, if you like, we just, we jump into the group with both feet, and we are, we're there to defend the group. We're there to do what it takes to bolster the group. And quite often that involves, being critical and trying to damage the outgroup. It is a bizarre effect.
And so here's I think the ultimate irony of all of social psychology is that it's evidence on the one hand that we are wonderfully pro-social, at times altruistic and willing to do anything for a person, with the very big caveat, as long as we perceive them to be part of our group, even a minimal group that's based on this arbitrary categorization. So on the one hand, yes, we're great, we're pro-social, we're compassionate, and yet we are spiteful, and we revel in Schadenfreude at the outgroup. We derogate the outgroup, and in fact, when there, like you said, when there's any whiff of a group that is outside or an outsider, that actually, we know from research and anecdotal evidence, strengthens the ties within the in-group. So it's these functions of intra-group and intergroup bias. So, and I don't think there's any, well, I could be wrong about this, and I hope I'm wrong, but it seems like there's no escaping it. It seems like we're always going to have in-groups, and those ties within the in-groups are going to be strengthened, especially in those moments when there's a presence of an out-group or an out-group member. So all that sort of theoretical speak, how do you see that, the sort of the double-edged sword nature of this bias that we have? How do you see that playing out in consumer or employee contexts? Is it like, I'm an Apple fan and I love my fellow Apple people, and anyone who's a Google or Android, go to hell? How do we navigate that in a consumer context?
I mean, I think so. The short answer, I don't have a particularly brilliant answer. Well, I don't have a brilliant answer at all for that one. But I think it's an interesting one, because it is as you say, it is the flip side of this being a lever that from a marketing and a sort of brand point of view, you could pull. I mean, when we did some of our experiments a few years back, we were playing with the idea of we completely artificially put consumers into groups based on what they believed was their performance in a little pre-task, and they were just put in at random. So there was no performance. There was no performance criterion to get into the group, and as a result of doing that, we saw them step up and do certain behaviours for the brand to a greater level than those who were not in the group. And specifically, we were looking at trying to get consumers. It was a sort of a co-creation exercise around a sort of social marketing campaign. We wanted to get consumers to sort of help in design and execute and give feedback on the campaign. And so what we did is we primed a group identity, which was around a mixture of creativity and innovation. And we found that those people that found themselves in that group amazingly stepped up and were more creative and more innovative, and that in one way translated into them just simply doing more lifting work for the brand. And that's a really sort of interesting effect. But then we found, to your point, that if we then introduced a group from the charity that was going to benefit from the social marketing, they didn't like them, which is exactly what you've just described there, in the sense that we use this group to deliver something for the brand. But then there was the risk that ultimately they're going to damage what they did because they didn't like the group that, in theory, was going to benefit from what they did. But but in that particular case, we did find a mechanic to break it down, and that was where we simply, and again, this is where this touches on lots of behavioral science work, that sometimes the intervention to control for a negative effect is just painfully simple, it appears. We found one way around this was we simply showed the in-group, so our respondents, our consumers who were doing all this work, we simply showed the in-group photographs of members of the out-group. And that is an individual little portrait, little sort of thumbnail images of the people who work for the charity. And that seemed to be enough to break the group identity. And I think this is process... I can't remember who sort of coined the term, but to re-individuate the individuals in the group. And then we saw that as a result of doing this, that they then no longer associated themselves as being part of this innovative creative group. They went back to being, by and large, individuals. And so that was a way to sort of, in effect, get the group effect when we wanted it, and then potentially sort of disband the group as soon as you got what you wanted, to then potentially avoid any sort of negative or sort of undoing effects, if you like, of what you've just achieved later on. So I think that's quite a sort of, it's a very specific example, but it does speak to exactly what you've just mentioned, that it does sort of, it cuts both ways, like so much of this. And I think maybe, again, going back to why business may be less right now, less focused or interested in this, is it just sounds a little bit messy. And I think behavioral science has done a fantastic job of presenting itself as not messy at all. And so, if you presented a client who has a problem and say, well, we could maybe play with some social identity effects, or we could just, present to them a social norm. I think most clients would say, let's just do the norm thing, because that doesn't seem messy. That seems very, very straightforward.
And it doesn't come with those risks of the outgroup derogation. Because if you bring up social identity theory and they go, okay, that's interesting, tell me a little bit more about that, and you give some examples, you point to some examples which are mostly coming from research and real world in terms of ideology and religion, and all of a sudden you're in a space where any business leader doesn't want to delve into, because it's like, oh, I don't want those risks to be associated with the brand. Yeah, I want to strengthen the brand identity and the fans of the brand or the business, but not necessarily at the cost of them hating or putting down a similar other brand that is different. But there's also, to push back on my point, there's the classic example is like Pepsi and Coke. It's a curious history with those two developing in the marketplace, on the backs of the other brand.
Yeah, no, I think Pepsi and Coke is I often use that when I'm teaching, to say, look, at the risk of all this sort of, this slightly, not more obscure at all, but this lesser known area of social psychology, if this all sounds a little bit too conceptual, look at the Coke Pepsi relationship, and actually go back to the 1970s and look at some of their TV spots, their advertising. And there's a classic one, I think from I can't remember the year now, maybe about 1990 actually, where it's the case of the Pepsi, the delivery guys mix up the Pepsi and the Coke, and they deliver the Pepsi to the old people's home, and the Coke to the frat house. And of course, the old people's home, they're all skateboarding and dancing and having a great time. And then you cut to the frat house, and they're there playing bingo, pulling the numbers out, and the two delivery guys go, Pepsi, Coke, what's the difference? And they're making the case that there is a huge difference. And this is a beautiful little, in effect, example of a company, maybe intuitively more than scientifically, if you like, sort of picking up on the fact that actually, you do get, you can't have an in-group without an out-group potentially. And, Pepsi needs Coke and vice versa. But yeah, and similarly with Audi and BMW, here in the UK, certainly a few years ago, there was definitely a push that Audi had in their advertising to sort of, if you're Audi, you're not BMW. And almost not being BMW was more important than being Audi, if you see what I mean. So again, this sort of, the out group was incredibly well defined, especially as Audi was trying to sort of,
and maybe that's okay,
itself as being more premium. Yeah.
I think, see that as okay? Yeah. Like we don't. I think it's perhaps I sort of set up a straw man or a false dichotomy where it's like we should, or we shouldn't. But maybe it's if it's effective in building those brand loyalties and identities, even if it means the opposite effect for a similar other brand, what's that's sort of market competition. And it's not they're going, if an avid Coke fan isn't going out and killing or committing these atrocities to Pepsi drinkers, or whatever the example you want to give. It's sort of this healthy level of competition. So I guess my question is like, is that okay?
I think it's fine. I think in the sense that in just the way that an Apple user will define themselves as not a PC user, and they'll find reasons that being in the Apple group is better. It works for the Apple the Apple user at that point, but similarly, the PC user will find lots of reasons to define the outgroup on different dimensions, if you like, to understand why Apple, again, you often see it when you're sort of, delivering content to students on master's programs or MBAs, and you get all the PC users who just think the Apple users are just in effect being ripped off because they're spending too much money on a bit of design. And then you get a lot of the Mac users who say, actually just the functional performance of these products is superior. So they sort of they can define and justify the sort of the in-group, out-group status on either side, so to speak. So I don't think necessarily anyone loses. And you say, I think it's probably just a way of sort of codifying to a certain extent what competition is really. I do think there are interesting consequences to it, though less so from a consumer point of view, but certainly within businesses in terms of employee behavior. I know that I think it's George Akerlof, the economist, wrote a book with I think someone called Rachel Scranton, I think it is, probably 10 years ago now, called Identity Economics, and it's very interesting. So rather than it being behavioral economics, it was identity economics, and they looked at how certain sort of economic incentives or levers that we often pull can crash across identities that are actually responsible for the behaviors at the time. And one of the clearest examples they give is paying bonuses, and they're saying that actually if your job in particular is very close to sits very close to a strong social identity for you, and so you are driven by what they'd say is more sort of intracyclical rather than impressions management reasons. In other words, I feel like this is part of who I am, so I want to do this job. If you then start dishing out bonuses, it causes a degree of confusion where the individual think, well, I wasn't doing it for the money, I was doing it because this is who I am. But now you're paying me money, so what does that say about me as to why I'm doing the job? And that can lead to a drop off in their performance. And the book makes a whole series. I think it has 10 little sort of topics, if you like, which it covers, where it's saying at each point, that actually, we should be mindful of these sort of identity effects, because, we crash about thinking, well, actually, let's give money back or take money away or, pull these various levers. And the reality is that, in many of these situations, it's as much of a sort of social contract that's working as it is an economic or financial one. And of course, they're finely balanced sometimes. And as soon as you sort of yank the economic lever, the sort of the financial market piece comes to the top, and that can sort of have detrimental effects on how people then perform as a result.
So you've been saying these things. You've been writing about them. Making these earnest attempts to bring in this level of conceptualization and social psychology into industry and into sort of an applied setting. And I go back to I believe it's a piece in The Guardian, and this dates back to 2012, which in the context of this behavior change revolution that we're in, that seems like eons ago. So in that piece, you talk about a lot of these things, especially when it comes to sustainable engagement around brands. So here we are 7-8 years later. Have you changed your position? Are you still saying the same things? Are you still optimistic that we can include some of these insights into the work that we're doing? I'm curious if time has changed your opinion.
Time definitely changes everything, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So I think the answer is yes and no to that. I think my main answer to that is time has changed my speech or my sort of position. Mainly, though, not because I don't see the value in that particular pocket or area of applied social psychology. I think what I'm acutely aware of, and this sort of speaks to a bigger problem, is if you are providing these services as a consultant or an advisor, You've got to be incredibly receptive to what the client wants and what their appetite is for solving a problem. And I think I've already mentioned one of those. I think it's conceptually a bit more knotty than some of the other areas, because the first, if anyone does get it, they go, well, blimey, then this just means that everything depends all the time. And you go, yes, it does really. And they think, right, so how would we extrapolate or generalize or, and you go, yeah, it gets quite complicated, doesn't it? Whereas, you show them something else, like some anchoring effect, and everyone goes, yeah, I like that because that's going to work every time, isn't it? Sort of thing. So there is this client desire. And I think there's always that slight tension that if you're a consultant, you need to sort of, you need to keep obviously the client with you. You need to answer the problem they've got, but also sometimes you need to sort of help them reframe what the problem is, etc. So I think the reason that time has changed me is I think that the almost the worst thing that any sort of behavioral science consultant can be is a one-trick pony, because it's whatever the expression is. If you've got a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail. And I think the problem with that, of course, is you sit in a room and the client says, we have this challenge with this or that and the other, and you go, that's a problem of social identity. And the reality is, you can probably twist anything round to your particular sort of the model of the month or the sort of theory of the month or whatever. And so I have broadened it out a lot because I just feel that it's very important to sit down in a commercial situation and have an open mind. I think otherwise you will be biased to sort of banging the same drum over and over again. And I think at some points, some of the stuff I've done the last couple of years does touch on the social identity stuff, and the sort of the actual context in which the intervention is going to be carried out, and group connections, etc. But probably the majority of times something else gets used, and I think it's just having to sort of carry around a broader, more than just a hammer, put it that way.
Yeah.
So I don't think my interest in it as an area is diminished at all. I just think that from an application point of view, I think it's the kiss of death if you end up being known as, or he or she is the person that knows about ... I think that's great from a research point of view. I don't think it's great from an application point of view.
And it's really interesting. I don't know, we talked offline a few weeks ago kind of about this. I believe you're the sort of the first guest on the show that's approaching behavioral insights more from an entrepreneurial endeavor versus policy or more classic management consulting or marketing. And so over the years, I've thought, as I build my business and build my brand, and I know you've thought about this as well, is how do you go to the marketplace? Do you go to the marketplace and conversations with prospects to be the person, to be the guy or the girl known to do X? And in fact, that is a lot of the recommendations you get from the books and the podcasts and all of the thought leadership out there on entrepreneurship and freelance consulting is find that niche. Now that, in contrast to doing applied behavioral science work, which says, or at least suggests the complete opposite, as you noted. And that's because behavioral science is just sort of a general methodology within which there are these different tools and toolkits, not just a hammer, but there's a hammer and a screwdriver and all these things that can be used when the context is right and when it calls for that tool. But now that seems to be at odds with a lot of what the sort of entrepreneurship branding suggests. So I'm curious if because to be perfectly frank, I'm still wrestling with that. And I'm still fairly new out of my PhD and building my business, but I'd be curious your thoughts about how you navigate those two pressures.
Yeah, I think it's a very. I wrestle with it too. To be honest, I think it's it's that classic dilemma that if you present yourself as a specialist in one thing, everything else to the left and the right goes past you. I think on balance. So there's two things to say. I think one is, I think on balance, I think as a practitioner, it's almost better to draw on the early part of your PhD rather than the later part. When you're doing the sort of the big wide literature review and you're sort of really digging into certain areas. I found that to be a very useful part of that process to draw on, because you can say, well, yeah, I do know. Chances are you probably do know a lot more than most people, even some of those topics that you ended up thinking were at the outer edges of what you ended up doing for the PhD. But I find that sort of breadth is quite useful, rather than sort of dipping in. It's a bonus if you get into something and it just so turns out that the thing you actually wrote your the experiment number 3 of your thesis is incredibly relevant to a particular issue. You can say, "Well, this is great. This is really, I'm really on my home turf now." But
yeah,
I think
if your mentor was Dan Ariely or George Lowenstein.
Yeah, but I think it's a mistake from a consulting point of view to obviously try and pull things towards what you know very well, because I think you just have to just keep the sort of the client's the client's problem in mind all the time. The other thing I would probably say in terms of how I try and juggle it a bit more is I think having that behavioral science knowledge, whether it's the broad bit at the beginning or the very, very focused bit that you really you became a sort of an expert on by virtue of getting a PhD. Increasingly, I feel that's obviously a critical part of doing the job, but it's by no means the only bit. And another critical piece is just the client skills, in terms of actually being able to sit in a room. My experience, and many other people will probably disagree with this, but my experience is that when it comes to the sorts of problems that business face, or the potential opportunities where our sort of knowledge could be useful, is that they're really ill-defined and they're not at all clear at this moment in time. And so they're not getting you in to say, look, we want to put out a tender to buy 50 new photocopiers. So how much is it going to cost? Where it's a nice known problem to solve, so to speak. That actually it's very much we sort of have this problem where we think there might be an opportunity that, and so I think actually those client skills in being able to first of all listen, and never assume you know the client's business better than they do, and then feed in what you know about or certainly how you could potentially reframe that challenge from a behavioral science point of view, is as critical and possibly more important than the actual knowledge that I think I have in the actual discipline itself. And I think that's my 2 cents worth on that piece. I think that actually there are plenty of incredibly, of course, far better behavioral scientists than I would ever be. But I don't know whether that's what the commercial market needs right now. I think it needs people who are credible and good on one side in terms of the sort of the academic and the theory and the understanding of the discipline, but also crucially have broadly those sort of commercial client skills on the other side. Because at the end of the day, it is a consulting proposition that you're selling in, and I think I would probably say that rather than thinking about do you have the knowledge to get to a solution, it's more about thinking about do I have the capabilities to provide a solution to them. In other words, it's not about doing the job; it's about getting the job done. And so, increasingly, I think actually, I know a bit about this, but I'm going to go and talk to someone else, another psychologist, and say, look, what's your take on this? Because you'll probably have a completely different view. And it's very, very rare you come out of those conversations and you're poorer for it. Actually, it's a more robust solution as a result. So I think for me, that's how I try and. I don't know whether I try and solve that dilemma or I just try and bypass it by thinking, well, actually, it's not all about the knowledge, whether that's very specialized or broader. That's just one component, and there's this big client skills piece on the other side.
Yeah, I think that the future goes to not just in this industry, in our space, but generally speaking, to those who are doing the translating.
Yes, I agree.
And that's how to echo what you said. There's people in my network on the academic side, and I wouldn't dare compete with them in terms of just pure research or raw intelligence. But I don't think they would do as good a job in translating that research, and talking to clients and managing those expectations and so on, and all the things that we know come with professional services and consulting. And I think it's particularly important in behavioral insights because, and this is going to change as things progress, but right now anyways, internally, when you're having those conversations with clients and people in the marketplace, they don't have that background. They don't have that scientific training or that PhD, or it doesn't necessarily have to be a PhD, but they don't have that experience. And yet they know it's important. They know they have to consider it. They know they have a problem in their organization that could be addressed with these behavioral insight solutions, but they don't know. And so now it's incumbent on people like us to go in and to do that translation and to sell them on the value that behavioral science, or dare I say social psychology, can bring to them and their business.
Yep.
So that, and I think there's a lot. I don't want you to sell yourself short on that explanation. I think there's a lot of insight in what you said, which is at the beginning of this last response there is that it's a reframing exercise. And I think this is how we differentiate ourselves from the classic consulting of, your 1990s McKinsey, BCG, Bain, is that we're not pretending to go in with all of the solutions and to know the client's business more than they do. We wouldn't pretend to. We listen, we go in, we hear, and then we map that against what we know in the realm of behavioral science. In related fields. And then we come up with, it's a reframing exercise to say, okay, this is what you've told me. Hey, look, I know this thing that could possibly work given some sort of reasonable hypothesis of XYZ. Let's go out and test it. Let's go out, run an intervention and have the data and follow the data, and let the data speak for.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I think, probably in that sort of translation role, there's a need for a fairly healthy dose of creativity, and not in a negative way at all, but in a very positive way. That I think, I say that so often with conversations that I have, you can sense straight away that there's a lot of uncertainty around the fact that they can't quite quantify what the issue is or what the opportunity may be, or there appears to be this fundamental conflict in terms of what they're trying to achieve. And I think one is getting to a point in that relationship where that conversation can be had, which is by no means easy. Two, I agree with you completely that so many consulting propositions walk into the room with a solution already in their heads, and so that the sole purpose becomes convincing the client of the solution, sort of thing. I certainly used to, from a marketing perspective, see that a lot of the time when I was working in marketing services. So I think if you are genuinely going in there saying, right, let's listen and let's see what we can do about this, I think that's great. But the creativity bit comes in where I think, well, quite often you do have to look sort of, tilt your head left or right to look at the problem and think, what might be quite interesting here is ... And that's sort of that's a whole different type of translation service, I think. It's not simply sort of translating, point for point, so to speak. It is actually, as you say, it's a reframing exercise, and part of that does require, a degree of creativity in terms of saying, well, this is what a solution might look like for you. Again, I think that's far easier said than done. So to find the sort of skill set, which is a combination of specialist knowledge, client skills, and then that little bit of creativity in there as well, I think it's more than a Venn diagram. Well, if you can have a Venn diagram with 3 circles, I'm not sure, but it's definitely 3 circles.
Yeah,
there's a bit in the middle,
multi-dimensional for sure.
Yeah, whatever it would be.
And that's especially the case because the science that we're drawing on, although it's somewhat well established, I suppose that's up for debate. We do have a science of 100 years or so. We have a repository of different findings and effects that we can leverage and lean on, but it's not the case that all that work is done like over on the basic research side. It's not like we have this sort of neat, nice, tidy box gift that we can open up and say, here's everything we know about human behavior and human nature. That exercise of the academics and doing that sort of theoretical conceptual work is a continued work in progress that they continue to add to that box. And so it's not as though we practitioners have it easy to go and pull from and say, this is everything we know and this is how we can do that translation. We have to be connected to the research that's being done on the academic side so that we can revise and update our own theories and our own hypotheses that we can then go to clients and discuss. And that's even more pertinent, I see, because of the replication crisis in academia and in social psychology and behavioral science. Because now it's like, okay, well, the last 100 years, we actually don't know a lot. And so we're they're reinventing themselves, which means we have to have our finger on the pulse to know what is true, what is not, what is robust, what is not. And so it's that translation piece is tricky to sum it up.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly not sort of recounting, a past event, which as you say, the ink is now dry and the book is closed. It is, and again, I think going right back to what we said at the beginning about maybe part of the reason that social identity theory doesn't stick as well as certain other areas is because it feels a bit messy. But I don't think it is any messier than the rest of it. I just think other effects, other areas have been, not to say it too strongly, but simplified, let's put it that way, streamlined into products and services that it does look painfully simple to do this. It was going to change this, tweak that, or whatever, and we're going to see these effects. And I think it ties into everything we've said that very good consultants embrace all the shades of grey and the sort of uncertainty. And the reality is that I think there's a huge client appetite for quick solutions, and I think behavioural science to a large extent has hung its hat on that peg in terms of saying that we're very fast, we're very quick, and we're very cheap. That may be true sometimes, but it shouldn't sort of downplay or sort of push to one side all the other opportunities there in terms of slightly more nuanced, slightly more sort of sophisticated approaches. But again, I think client appetite isn't quite there for a lot of that just yet. But again, I think what stimulates that appetite is good consulting skills as much as good knowledge in the areas in question.
And that nuance and that level of granularity, that there might be more interest down the road, that will whet their appetite because they'll see the return on that investment. Because we know that if these effects are, if there's a little bit more nuance associated with these effects, then if you intervene on those and if you're aware of them, then you can come around and say, hey, look, this is actually what's happened, as opposed to what you initially thought, or what behavioral scientists initially thought 5 years ago. There's a moderating factor here, or something that we have to consider. And they go, oh, wow. And then you can see the impact on their business. So I think, we're still early days, but I'm convinced that in the next 10 years, 20 years plus and beyond, that we're going to be able to maintain some level of that scientific rigor in the work we do in the marketplace, and to get into the space where there is more nuance, to get into the space where we start to draw on these other considerations like social identity theory and these other things that are a little bit more variable and messy and noisy. That's my optimistic take on it anyway.
No, I think, and I hope you're right. And I think from a business point of view, I think we're still in the phase of bright, shiny anecdotes where business goes, oh, didn't you see this? That is the nature of best practice, and sort of little mini case studies. So I think we will transition from anecdotes to like an anecdotal approach to the application of this stuff to, and it's a really overused word, but I think in this case it's valid, a strategic application to this. In other words, we will start to see businesses with behavioral strategies, and that behavioral strategy covers everything from it'll touch employee recruitment, retention, and engagement. It'll touch the innovation process. It'll touch marketing. It'll touch the consumer, etc. And I don't think we're there yet. I think we are still cherry picking, or that industry businesses cherry picking little bits here and there as a way to buff up and shine part of the business, or maybe sort of correct an issue. I don't think we've actually knitted it together yet into this idea of actually, well, what would a behavioural strategy look like across the business? And that then raises interesting questions about and then who would be responsible for that. But I think that time is coming, simply because we can just pick off 1,001 examples of where behavioural science can have an impact in those areas. What we don't currently have right now is a more proactive approach to this. I think we're still in the case also where a lot of the time it's the intervention of last resort, where either the problem is too complex to do it another way, or we've lots of other things have been tried. I'd probably say, no exaggeration, maybe half of the projects I get involved in, you can tell that the subtext is, we thought this would be easier to do, and it hasn't worked. And I think that's fine, but we could be more proactive, I think, in terms of saying, well, rather than waiting to that point, we could potentially save a lot of money and move a lot of uncertainty out of this process if we sort of were more proactive and say built a sort of behavioural strategy that stretched across the business potentially.
Yeah, and I know that's the focus of the work that you're doing, and a lot of the offerings that you give and that you deliver on. And in talking to other people, even on the show, there was Dilip Soman and Matt Wallert. The question I asked them is like, do you think, to deliver on the strategic vision of behavioral insights, do you think we need a CBO, if that's the term we go with, a Chief Behavioral Officer, which Matt is at Clover Health? And two, if so, do you think in the next 10, 20 plus years that every organization, no matter the sector, no matter the domain, that they need a C-suite executive who is a behavioral expert?
I mean, I don't know whether I'm being optimistic and idealistic, but I think my answer would be yes. I think even now one could make the case for what that role would contribute across the business. I think it would be a very challenging role, because by definition it's a sort of transversal role. Whereas a lot of those roles are vertical, if you like. But that bit to one side, I think if you gave me a sheet of paper and said, right, quickly write down 10 ways that behavioral science could influence recruiting, employee engagement, innovation, marketing, sales, the customer experience, etc. I think none of us would have a problem writing what it could do in those areas. And so the opportunity to have the potential of having someone or a team that says, right, rather than just having these siloed reactive responses to these things that we know can make a difference, what would it look like if we stitched it all together, and rather than using behavioral science to fix things, use behavioral science to imagine the thing in the first place, so to speak. And I think there's there is some interesting work. You can see some of the big consulting firms are getting quite close to this. I think. I'm not saying that I'm ahead of them at all. They're far smarter than I'll ever be. But when you see some of the work, for example, Deloitte is doing now, and if you go onto behavioral scientists, you can see some interesting articles where you're starting to see frameworks appear that try and combine behavioral science and strategy to a certain extent, or behavioral science and design, or innovation, and that seems to be the sort of the natural way of things as a discipline starts to become a function, or starts to be more respected as something more systemic in the business, rather than a sort of crisis solution, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I do see it coming, and yes, I think. Maybe the title, if it's the right title or not, but I think certainly someone or a team in that role. I say maybe I'm being naive, but it strikes me that there's an opportunity, and and the business would certainly benefit from it.
Well, then you and I are similar, not just in our trainings and our trajectory, it seems, but I think we're both ideological and optimistic in what we expect to happen. But I think we need to be to give it its due and to give it a fair shot. And obviously we believe it, and obviously, hopefully a lot of the people listening in believe it, or at least are curious and interested. And the more conversations I have, the more I detect that optimism, or at least a cautious level of it. And it really comes down to just doing stuff and getting it out there in the form of content, of talking and presenting and or podcasting for that matter, and having these conversations with ourselves and with clients. And I think that's the way it's going to happen, and hopefully sooner than later. But you're right, the big players, they've detected the scent, and I think they are on the prowl. of
Yes, no, I agree. I think there's definitely, I think the jury is in, if that's the right expression, in terms of how valuable behavioral science is for business. I think the jury is still debating what it looks like as a function, and I think you can see that with some of the big consulting firms, that they're sort of slightly hedging their bets. They're giving a little bit more airtime to it as a topic. They're sort of pushing the debate. They're provoking the debate a bit, because I think it's interesting when you watch those big consulting firms. Obviously, they need to take new stuff to their clients, but they can't get too far ahead of their clients. And I think that's good client management and good client skills. And I think it may be, ironically or appropriately, the behavioral science topic, if you like, is a good example of that, where they're sort of probing and nudging to see what this might look like. So yes, I think it will come. I think it will come. And again, what will sort of mark its success, I think will increasingly be less about the science. I mean, obviously that's incredibly important and will always be a huge part of it, but where it needs to grow from going from a discipline to a function is in its ability to fit within the business. I think there's no shortage of incredibly smart people who know all everything there is to know about heuristic and biases and choices, values, and frames, and what have you. That I don't think is the mountain that has to be climbed now.
Yeah.
I think as you say, it's that translation service, and it's translating it into not just a language but a process that business recognizes, and that's the next hurdle, which I think a lot of people are in mid hurdle at the moment. If that's if that metaphor isn't going horribly wrong.
No, it's a good one. We're part way up that mountain, or halfway over the jump, whatever.
That's right. I mean, doing hurdles on a mountain doesn't sound like a sensible thing to do, but yeah,
that's exactly it. So one final question, Guy, if you don't mind, I've kept you a little bit longer than I anticipated. I ask all guests this, so it's the BBB, the big behavioral brainstorm. Of all the problems out there, whether it's in industry, in governance or policy, what do you see as the biggest one where behavioral insights can play an important and positive role?
Gosh, you save the biggie to the end, don't you? Well, I will probably give you if I can, quite a general answer to that. So I have a very clear answer, but it's quite general. And I think what I find very interesting and honestly incredibly exciting, and at my age you don't get excited that often, is this idea that business now, you get this huge movement where I think it was in August that the Business Roundtable in the US, 180 plus CEOs signed a letter saying that shareholder value was no longer the most important thing, or certainly not the primacy of shareholder value was sort of under question. You get this big movement around purposeful leadership in businesses. I think when you look at the problems that governments face around the world at the moment, and that sounds like the most ridiculously overgeneralized statement, but unfortunately it is largely true. when you look at the sort of the inability of governments to operate well at the moment, I think a lot of people are now looking to business to solve to step in terms of guiding, for example, policy and sorting out many of the sort of social challenges we face. And you may have concerns about whether business is in the right place to do that, but in the absence of anyone else, I think there's a vacuum, and there is an increasing expectation. There's an increasing realization that business potentially has the resources, the agility, the creativity, the innovation, and just the sheer scale to step in and be a force for good. And I think 180 CEOs in the US say the same thing. And it's not just in the US. If you look, in North America, if you look generally, I think there is this recognition that actually solving these social issues is not just about maintaining a social contract or a license to operate. It is an opportunity. I think Peter Drucker said in the 1950s, I think, Peter Drucker's definitely said it, I'm not quite sure when, he said every social problem that faces us is a business opportunity in disguise. And I think that has never been more relevant than it is now, partly because of the problems we face and also because of government's failure generally. And I think behavioral science is right in the middle of that. And I think that is why behavioral science inside a business could be so incredible, because it can provide that translation between what the business wants to try and achieve and understanding what it can do. It's both boots on the ground, and it's the very, very special envoy to the very top of the company. And so for me, that's the big challenge and the big opportunity, that I think that we would really scuff it if we didn't sort of cement our part in this process, because we are a critical link between all these pieces now, in terms of what the business does when it interacts with the market, to what the business says it's going to do, and then increasingly business being pushed into the sort of spotlight to say, look, you need to do more than you currently do. And behavioral science is pivotal, I think, in marrying those pieces up and critically helping them make money in the process. And I have no problem with that at all. I think if you can socially innovate rather than just innovate, this idea of commercial social innovation, great, make money from it. We definitely need lots of solutions to lots of problems. And I think that for me, that's the huge opportunity to position behavioral science and be instrumental in sort of finding those social and commercial solutions.
Well, I didn't think you could get more optimistic in your answers, but you did there. You topped it off lovely. And I'll sort of quips aside. I'm totally in agreement with you, and I'm convinced of this more and more. I was a little bit more cynical in my early days of graduate school and my training, but now being in an industry, I see this, and there is this change. There's this sort of tide that's taken effect. There's that I've never heard that Peter Drucker quote, but that basically sums it up beautifully. And I think there'd be a lot more cynicism at that time and over the decades, but now there seems to be this shift, and even the big and famous VCs in North America and in the US and Silicon Valley are saying that exact same thing. Jason Calacanis, I know, is this famous entrepreneur and angel investor who he's been making this argument for quite a while, saying the biggest problems we face socially, culturally, economically, are best solved through entrepreneurship and through the commercialization of different products and services. And he has some really great cases with water, drink like access to clean drinking water, and also saving the ocean and the species in the ocean. So things that are an issue that normally would be reserved for not-for-profit or government agencies. He says, no, on the contrary, it should be these commercial endeavors. So I'm very much aligned with that. And I think I really enjoyed your very generic answer to that question. So thank you.
Good.
And
sometimes generic is good. Yeah.
Thank you for, as I said, I've kept you. I told you 40 minutes, and I think we're over an hour now. So it's been a great conversation.
The time flies by, Nick. The time flies by. Yeah. No, I'm really grateful for the chance to sort of chat with you, and I think obviously it's fantastic to sort of find like-minded people. So yeah, the pleasure's all mine.
Totally. Well, thanks, Guy. Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in the episode can be found on the BS Podcast page of The Behaviourist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting, easy-to-apply, sciencey stuff. Just go to www.behaviourist.biz/BS podcast. And lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes. Why should you? Because 1, you're a part of a digital-wide social proof exercise. 2, you're helping combat the negativity bias in the form of positive reviews. And 3, it's a little pre-commitment for your habitual podcast listening. A little investment to keep you coming back for more BS. I mean, how much more behavioral can you get? Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.